Question. Hi Kim, how can we tell the difference between a psychic projection from the mental realm and something that is our own wound or feeling? I've heard other students talk about rather you feel a resistance, and if you do, it is your own, and if you don't feel a resistance, it is not yours. Is this correct? If we have a wounded aura, is it opening in the solar plexus, can we feel emotional projections that aren't ours? My reasoning is that we wouldn't feel them if we didn't have something in us that made us vulnerable. Okay, so if you're not familiar with this concept, just very briefly, I've explained in several videos that there are 4 levels of the material world we're living in. And there are 4 levels of our minds, and they of course correspond to each other. So what we can say is, in our individual minds, we have, first of all, we have in the spiritual realm, we have our higher self, our spiritual self, which are also called the I Am Presence. And there's energy flowing from the I Am Presence into our lower being, our auras, our energy fields. And it first flows into the identity level, where our deepest sense of identity is anchored, then into the mental, where our thoughts are, and then into the emotional, which is of course our feelings, and then finally into the physical body and brain. So, when we are in embodiment on a planet like Earth, we are of course not isolated units. No man is an island. So we live within this collective energy field, which also has the 4 levels: identity, mental, emotional, physical. So the question really is, I mean, we can't avoid, when we're growing up, to somehow be affected by this collective field. We are affected by it in our families, in our immediate societies, in our countries, and in the world in general. So what we can say is that we are living inside of this greater energy field, the collective energy field. And in the collective energy field, there's a lot of energy that has accumulated over time, like for example anger energy. And this anger energy has taken on a certain form where it's not really a conscious entity or being, but it has some sense of consciousness and survival instinct. So it has the sense that it can only survive by getting energy from people. So this anger entity, and there's of course many others, but this anger entity is constantly projecting into your personal energy field to get you to engage in anger. And so this projection happens at the emotional level, which is the most immediate. You can sometimes feel there is this anger energy coming at you, but it also happens at the mental level, where you can have projections of that cause you to engage in anger, where you think it's necessary to be angry in certain situations, or it's justified. And you can even have at the identity level, you can have people, for example, who basically see themselves as angry people, or at least they see themselves as being these righteous people who have a right to feel righteous indignation when other people don't live up to their expectations. So you can see how people can have this, even at the identity level, a certain sense of identity that sets the stage for them reacting with anger. Then at the mental level, they can have certain beliefs that makes it seem justified or necessary that they react with anger. And then at the emotional level, they can have in their personal energy fields an accumulation of anger energy, which then gives an opening for the collective anger entity to project more energy into their energy field. So, for example, a person has a tendency to feel angry, which means that there's a certain amount of energy accumulated in a person's personal energy field. And in normal situations, this is below the threshold of conscious awareness. So the person isn't going around constantly being angry. But here comes a situation where the person has a mental belief that it's okay to be angry or necessary to be angry. And at the same time, there may very well be a projection from the collective field. And suddenly, instead of just a personal anger energy, there's this influx of anger energy, and now it boils over. Now the person can't contain it anymore, and the person loses it and becomes very, very angry. So this is a common pattern you can learn to see in people. So what I'm trying to say here is, we are constantly exposed to these projections of various forms of energy. But there are two ways to deal with this. So the more immediate way is that we can invoke spiritual protection from the Ascended Masters. I have a whole playlist on Spiritual Toolbox where I have decrees and an invocation to Archangel Michael. So you can invoke the energy of Archangel Michael to create a shield of high frequency energy around your personal energy field. And that will then shield you from these projections of anger, generally speaking. You can also call to an Ascended Master called the Elohim Astrea to cut you free from any ties to these collective entities. But of course, these decrees and invocations are not going to override your free will. So if you really want to be free of anger, you need to use the tools that I've talked about in many of my talks, including my breakthrough videos on these subconscious selves. You need to recognize that, as the person actually says in the question, what makes you vulnerable to the collective entities is that you have something in your own energy field. Accumulation of energy, beliefs, a certain sense of identity. So you need to look at that. That's the long-term solution, is to look at that and resolve that. Okay, so back to the question. The person is saying that when you feel a psychic projection, the question is it just coming from the outside, or do you also have something in yourself, something unresolved in yourself that makes you vulnerable to it? And the way I would look at it is that, the person is saying here, if you feel resistance, then you have something in your own energy field. If you don't feel a resistance, you don't. And there can be some validity to that, but what is the resistance? The resistance is actually a resistance to looking at something in yourself. And I can remember many situations from my own past where I can see that there was a projection coming at me from the outside, and it stirred up something in myself. But I was reluctant to look at myself and say, oh, where's it coming from? So you can have a certain mechanism there where these subconscious selves, they want to project that, they want to hide. You understand? These subconscious patterns that you have, they don't want you to see them. So they want to project, oh, it's just coming from the outside. So in other words, I can look back and I can see that for a time I had this teaching about the personal energy field and the projections from the collective. I was in a sense using that as an excuse where I was saying, oh, it's just projections from the collective, I don't need to pay attention to them. I could just call to Archangel Michael to be protected from this. But as I said, the calls don't nullify your free will. So there came a point where I realized, no, I actually have to look at myself. And when after some time, I came to realize that whenever I feel this resistance, it's because there's a resistance from a subconscious self to me looking at the self, looking for the self, flushing it out in the open and dealing with it. So there's certainly validity to that. So the person is then asking, if we have a wounded aura or an opening in the solar plexus, can we feel emotional projections that aren't ours? And yes, that's true if you have a wound in your aura. But the thing is, why do you have a wound in your aura? You see, you have a wound in your aura because you have a subconscious self that's preventing your aura from being healed, being whole. So there is a correspondence. In other words, what I'm trying to say is we are constantly exposed to these projections from the outside. Constantly, from the collective. And in the short term, we can invoke spiritual protection, so we get a reprieve from it. So we're no longer so overwhelmed by it. And the spiritual protection can then allow us more clarity, so there's less chaos in the emotional body, for example, so we can see the subconscious self and resolve it. And when we resolve the self, it's not that we won't feel the projections, because the projection is always going to be there, but they will pass right through us. They will not, if there's no subconscious self that corresponds to the projection, there's nothing in you that can be stirred up. So therefore, you don't have a reaction to it. And then it just passes right through you. Now, I have, I still on a daily basis feel certain projections. Sometimes I have a certain thought that comes up. But I have learned to recognize that it's just a projection. And when I don't have a corresponding self, I've learned to just ignore the thought. I mean, basically, as soon as I become aware of it, I just let it go. I just let it go. And it just passes right through. This is what Jesus meant when he said, the prince of this world cometh and has nothing in you. The prince of this world is constantly coming at you with these projections. But if there's nothing in you that stirs it up, then it just passes right through. So in other words, the reason why you're vulnerable to the projections is there's something in you. That these projections, it's like there's a correspondence of the energy. You know energy is vibration, right? So there are certain energies that are close enough to each other in frequency that they can interact with each other. They form this interference pattern. And so anger energy in your personal field makes you vulnerable to anger energy from the collective. So that is the subconscious self. And so the short-term solution is to a spiritual protection, so you're not so overwhelmed by the projections from the outside. But the long-term solution is to resolve the self so you become transparent to the energy. And you actually don't need a spiritual protection anymore, at least not for that particular kind of energy. I'm not saying there can be other energies that you might be vulnerable to. So, it's a good measure to look at yourself. When you can identify there's some kind of projection coming at you, can you feel some kind of resistance in you? Then that's because there's something in you that's being stirred up by this external energy. And as I said, the ultimate solution is to resolve that self, and I've given a lot of talks about how to do that, but it's also important to transform whatever energy is accumulated. It's like I always explain, it's a twofold process. You have the self, which is basically at the bottom of the self is a certain belief that's based on an illusion. So you need to uncover that belief and consciously change it. But part of the self is also the energy that's accumulated. So if you have a self that's based on the belief that it's okay to be angry in certain situations, there's also an accumulation of anger energy. And resolving the self doesn't make the energy go away. That's why you invoke spiritual energy, high frequency energy from your ascended masters. And the best way to transform energy you already have accumulated is the violet flame energy, which you can evoke from the ascended master Saint Germain. There's again decrees and an invocation in my spiritual toolbox playlist. So basically what I would say here, I mean, the person is asking, if you have a wounded aura, can you then feel emotional projections that aren't yours? And what I'm saying is, the wounded aura comes from a subconscious self, because otherwise the aura would have been healed. Now, again, I'm not trying to make light of this, because I have several videos where I talk about how we can have been very severely traumatized in the past. I have a whole playlist about avatar psychology where I talk about this. So it's very possible that we can have a very, very deep wound that goes back to a very severe trauma in a past lifetime. So I'm not trying to trivialize this and say, oh, it's 5 minutes you can heal this. It can take you sometimes. I mean, for me, sometimes it's taken years to deal with a certain wound. But once it was healed, I also felt completely different. Instead of dragging this weight along with me as I'd been doing all of my life up to that point, I'm now free of it. So it's definitely worth it to do the work. But I guess what I wanted to say with this is that there's no such thing as just a wounded aura. Because your aura will naturally heal itself if there's nothing inside of you that creates an opening. And I guess I should be careful with how I use words here, because what I'm saying is it's like if you have a subconscious self that's based on a trauma, it's almost like there is, from the self, there's like this funnel that goes outside of your aura. So you can say, just to give you an image, a visual image, that there is this hole in your aura and there's a funnel that goes right into that self. So that's why the energy from the collective can be directed through that. But if you resolve the self and transform the energy that's accumulated, then the funnel goes away and your aura is now healed. But this doesn't mean that you still can't, you still will be exposed to these projections. And you might notice them. You might still sometimes feel a certain emotional energy and certainly a mental energy where you have certain thoughts that are projected at you. But as I said, you can learn to identify, oh, it's just a projection, and then just let it go. It's just like you learn to identify it, and then you just take your attention away from it. You don't give it life, you don't give it energy, you don't give it attention. So then it just passes through, is what I'm saying. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, I'm giving you the visual image that you can have holes in your aura that makes you vulnerable. But even when your aura is whole, it doesn't mean that you can't have certain thoughts, because if it's like part of being an embodiment on Earth is to be somewhat sensitive to other people, right? Otherwise you become a sociopath who is completely closed off to other people. And that's actually not a good thing, because that person is then completely focused in on itself. So you have a certain awareness of other people, you have a certain attunement to other people, what they're going through, and even to the collective. You're sort of aware of what's happening in the world. The trick is to find that middle way where you can be aware without being disturbed by it. And I've talked about that in several other talks. But it's again this, you start by invoking protection, so you're sealed off from the projections from the outside, but then you use that reprieve you get to look for the self that makes you vulnerable, resolve that, then you no longer need the protection because now you become transparent. It's like it just passes right through. So your aura will always be connected to the collective. So it's not a matter of constantly sealing yourself off so you don't feel what's happening on Earth. But it is a matter of coming to this point where there is nothing in you, no subconscious self in you, that the collective energies can stir up. So if you don't have a self that thinks it's appropriate to be angry, and if you don't have any accumulated anger energies, then the collective projection of anger energy, nothing it can stir up, and that means if you don't give it any attention, it just passes right through. You become, instead of being sealed off, walled off, you become transparent. And that's the long-term goal.